Hello, I'm Kamal Santamaria. This is Counting the Cost on Al Jazeera, your weekly look at the world of business and finance. This week, austerity debunked. So much damage done to so many economies. So who got their maths wrong? And why did it take a 28-year-old grad student to figure out austerity doesn't work? Also this week, Slovenia, the country hotly tipped to be the next bailout recipient. We talked to the CEO of the country's biggest bank, who believes the world's got it all wrong. And an economic policy which favoured the indigenous people of Malaysia, but pushed many others away. Will it be reformed after the coming elections? So, has austerity finally been discredited? Now, the theory went, growth slows when a country's debt rises above 90% of GDP. In other words, too much debt means the economy can't grow, which in theory sounds pretty sound. In fact, so sound it was used by politicians, mostly in Europe, to slash their spending, leading to mass unemployment, anemic growth and struggling economies. In the end, it took a graduate student from the University of Massachusetts to undermine a study on austerity by the respected economists Carmen Reinhardt and Kenneth Rogoff. We'll hear from him in this programme, but first, Lawrence Lee puts it all in some perspective.
Over the course of the last 3 years, Europe has changed beyond anybody's reckoning. Greece has had to sell off its islands. Ireland has proposed selling off its national forests. Britain has forced the disabled to go to work and taxed the poor for having a spare bedroom. In France, as in many other countries, the old will have to work longer. In Spain, there's the kind of unemployment levels that have in the past led to the creation of a military junta. There have been riots, the near collapse of the currency, and all because of one thing, one overriding necessity forced on the people by the political class of a continent: austerity. The new austerity, of course, began in 2010, a couple of years after the banks had collapsed. Along came two respected American economists who argued that the problem wasn't a financial crisis, but a sovereign debt crisis, that states which had debt levels of more than 90% of their gross domestic products couldn't grow their economies. This was seized on as a political justification by politicians from Westminster to Brussels, the International Monetary Fund to the European Union, to say that they needed to spend less on their people if their economies were ever to grow again. But 3 years on, it's now turned out that the premise on which austerity theory was based was flawed. A 28-year-old PhD student discovered that the academics had made basic mistakes in the theory on which politicians across Europe have been basing their policies.
They hadn't essentially added up a column in Excel, the spreadsheet they used properly. They should have had 20 countries that they added up and took the average of. They only took 15, and that distorted the result. So there's a calculation error, quite a basic calculation error. Which in turn has prompted austerity's many critics to renew their calls for Europe's political elite to think again.
I think they're realising that austerity might have been flawed and wrong, but perhaps more seriously that whatever everyone thinks of the past, going forward, it's not clear that this is a sustainable path, and that if they don't want things to come apart, they will need to change course.
None of which is to say that austerity might not have happened anyway, but it still raises all sorts of questions. Was there ever any need for all this economic damage to the lives of so many poor people? Will the political class across Europe accept they may have got some of their economics wrong, not just in practice, but in theory as well? And most of all, can Europe actually recover?
Now, as mentioned in Lawrence's report, Thomas Herndon was the graduate student who uncovered the errors in the Reinhardt and Rogoff study. He spoke to Julian MacDonald about how he came to those conclusions.
When you have debt to GDP above 90%, then average growth falls notably. I replicated that paper and was unable to replicate their claim. In fact, I found that growth did not fall noticeably when debt to GDP goes higher than 90%.
Now, common sense, I suppose, would dictate to me that to have some limit on the amount of debt that you have as per GDP would be a good thing. Are we now saying that actually you don't have to have any limit at all?
That would be absurd to say there should be that public debt is always good. I think the message for policy of our paper is that we should look at the trade-offs involved with public debt and look at the costs and the benefits. And I think if we do that, we'll find that in the current particular time we're at right now, the circumstances are such that public borrowing can have really large positive effects on the economy and comparatively smaller costs.
And Thomas, are there examples of countries which have increased their debt beyond this limit and as a result flourishing?
I think one of the most interesting results we found was that if you look at the most current period from 2000 to 2009, countries with debt to GDP above 90 actually grew faster than countries with debt to GDP between 60 and 90. And I think this is also the more relevant period for current policy. Moreover, I would say that based on the current historical moment, this is also the time when we would expect austerity policies to have very large negative effects with comparably few benefits.
Now, Europe's austerity drive is partially to blame for Slovenia's economic troubles. It's in recession for the second time in 4 years and is racing to avoid becoming the 6th Eurozone nation to need a bailout. As demand for its exports declines, Slovenia's banks are sitting on bad debts worth an estimated $9 billion, or a fifth of its economy. It also needs to raise almost $4 billion this year to refinance debt, a budget shortfall, and the banks, which alone need to raise $1 billion, a figure which international organisations and credit ratings agencies think isn't enough. So what does the head of Slovenia's biggest bank think? Well, let's ask him. Janko Medja from NLB is joining us from the capital, Ljubljana. And tell me, in your opinion, where did Slovenia's problems start? Was it a victim of contagion around Europe, as they say, or has Slovenia got its own particular problems?
Hi, thank you for having me. I think it's a bit of both. I think Slovenia has a bit of its own problem, and of course it has also suffered heavily during the recession in Europe, of course, as its main trade and export partner.
Okay, can you elaborate on that for me a bit more, Janko? More on Slovenia's actual internal problems?
Well, personally, I think Slovenia was the most successful former Yugoslavian member when it seceded in the early 90s, and after that it had quite a booming development in the second half of that decade. After substituting the lost markets of the former Yugoslavia and refocusing on the European exports and the global competitiveness. But unfortunately, at least some people believe that it should have gone further in privatizing Slovenia's economy, because then in the subsequent years and in the first decade of the 2000s, it has somehow lost a little bit of the edge and it has over-leveraged the economy, which then in turn also caused over-leveraging of the banks as well. And if you add the fact that some of the privatization that has occurred by leveraged buyout loans financed mainly by domestic banks that then refinanced abroad, you can see that when these companies failed by the trigger of the European and global crisis, of course the indebtedness to the international markets remained, while the debt servicing capacity has not.
And joining the euro back in 2007, I know hindsight is a wonderful thing, but was that a mistake in the end?
No, I definitely would not say that, because the European Union is our main export market, so there have probably been, and for sure have been, very big benefits gained from that.
Okay, so where to from here, do you think? There is talk from financial institutions and other organisations that Slovenia will actually need a bailout like so many other European countries have needed. Do you think it's headed that way, at least?
I don't think it has yet gotten to that stage. I believe that Slovenia now has relatively short deadlines to explain both to its own public as well as to the European Union what its steps are going to be, and immediately also work on implementing those steps. I know that some of these steps are already being taken, and I'm an optimist that Slovenia will solve these problems.
Yes, but how optimistic can you be when there is an estimated $9 billion worth of debt out there? As we calculate it, that would be, well, a fifth of the economy. I mean, that is a big sort of sum of money to replace, and there's a big decline in exports to think about as well.
I think one thing should be cleared up. You know, when we're talking about 7 billion, this is roughly, let's say, 20% of banks lending. And these are non-performing loans by definition, loans that have some delays, but not all of this is lost. Therefore, some of these loans obviously carry good collateral, and some of them obviously are also already provisioned partially. So if you look at whole numbers, would probably be much smaller. This is why the government of Slovenia, after making also external due diligences in the largest state-owned banks, have estimated the capital needs to roughly 1 billion, which, if you then look at the indebtedness level of Slovenia and combine with the reforms that Slovenia needs to do, is definitely manageable and is also serviceable in the future.
Tell me then, Janko, about your long-term European thoughts. You know, we are 4+ years into this crisis now. We've seen recent GDP and unemployment figures which show things aren't really going to get very much better. What sort of long-term view of the Eurozone crisis do you take in Slovenia?
Well, I mean, there's some debate these days about what Slovenia might be in 30 years down the road. I believe Slovenia has so far in the past shown that it can solve its problems. Sometimes it does it in the last minute, to be fair, but it does solve its problems and usually can be flexible enough to turn and then again become competitive in the international market. We have to decide what Slovenia can be good at, what it can be most competitive at, and then invest in those industries, in those areas, in those pools of knowledge, and develop them with the help of both Slovenian professionals and public as well. I mean, you know, all the civil society experts and people who can contribute are sometimes not being heard. And obviously we should also look to the foreign experts, maybe even some technical help, which could allow us to proceed faster.
Janko Medja, pleasure talking to you today. Thank you for your time. And we round out our European tour this week in Spain, where during its economic boom there was an influx of immigrants from Spanish-speaking countries. But for the first time since records began back in 1857, Spain's population fell last year as people got out of the country to avoid the recession. Rory Challens now with the story of one Ecuadorian who's planning to leave Spain.
Lincoln's daughter has never been to Ecuador, the land her father left 10 years ago. But soon she'll be calling it home. Like thousands of Spain's immigrants, the Menas have decided to leave.
Here with the crisis, things are really bad. There's no work. Last year I was employed for just 5 months. And in this country, with that amount of money, you can't live. So the only option I have left is returning to my country.
For years, Lincoln worked in construction. Now he's training to be a teacher. Once he's got his qualifications, the family will go. 206,000 immigrants left Spain last year, causing the country's first ever registered population decrease.
Spain is a big bridge to Latin America and North Africa for young people to come and work here, and has been like some kind of paradise in the last years. For them to work in this business, which now are completely collapsed.
The options for anyone looking for work in Spain are disheartening. Either tough it out in a frighteningly grim economy or start again somewhere else.
And the news keeps getting worse. The very latest figures show that Spain has just broken the unemployment record set at the end of last year. 6.2 million people are now jobless, 27.2% of the population. This country is in uncharted territory.
It isn't what Lincoln wanted, but his daughter will grow up an Ecuadorian, not a Spaniard.
Now, our other focus this week is Malaysia, a looming election which looks like the closest battle since independence from Britain more than 6 decades ago. In that time, the ruling BN coalition has delivered great economic growth, which it hopes will elevate Malaysia to a high-income country by 2020. In fact, Prime Minister Najib Razak plans to spend $444 billion along with the private sector to achieve that goal. But there's some controversial policies too, especially one which favoured and thus raised the status of indigenous Malays. But according to the Centre for Independent Studies, also raised the country's budget deficit. It's a policy which forced many Chinese and Indians to leave Malaysia. More than 304,000 left between March 2008 and August 2009, compared to just 140,000 who left in 2007. It is, says the World Bank, a high-intensity migration of skilled people. Florence Louis explains now what led to that exodus.
Race riots in 1969, economic inequality, a political crisis. These were the circumstances that led the Malaysian government to implement a bold, radical economic policy. The ultimate goal was national unity, by reducing poverty and ensuring a more equitable wealth distribution among the three main races, the Malays, Chinese and Indians. The predominant indigenous group, the Malays, were the most economically backward then. In 1970, the average income of a Malay household was lower than the national average, and so it came to be that the policy would be targeted at helping the Malays. Even though the new economic policy has formally ended, its affirmative action element has been retained in subsequent economic plans. Malays, also known as Bumiputra, which literally means Prince of the Earth, enjoy certain privileges, including housing discounts, education quotas, and preferential treatment when it comes to government contracts. And it is this that some economists say has led to a culture of dependency and corruption.
Over the last 2 decades, we've seen the confluence between political interests and that of the political elites of this country and the business interests in this country to try and use this policy to meet their own specific objectives. And along the way, while many ordinary indigenous Malays have benefited from this policy, there are also others that have disproportionately profited more.
This special treatment for Bumiputra has also fueled discontent among non-Malay races. According to a World Bank report released in April 2011, the number of skilled Malaysians living abroad has tripled in the last 2 decades. We met Shireen Ong in Hong Kong 3 years ago. She said what she told us then still holds true.
I have no plans to return to Malaysia, not anytime in the near future. But what would make me return is maybe when all Malaysians are treated equally.
The Malaysian government recognises human capital flight to be a serious problem. It set up Talent Corporation Malaysia to persuade Malaysians who've left for greener pastures to return home by throwing out incentives like lower income taxes. The programme has not met with much success. And the Prime Minister Najib Razak has said affirmative action policies will stay. It is instead opposition politicians who are promising a break from the past. In Penang, a northern state controlled by the opposition coalition, Chief Minister Lim Guan Eng has implemented open tenders for government projects. His critics saw it as an insidious move to dismantle affirmative action policies. But people like Tahir Jalaluddin Hussein, a building contractor and an ethnic Malay, says he's happy to see the old way of doing business gone.
You don't need to pay a single cent here and there. You don't need to know anybody. If you can perform, that's it.
Opposition politicians say any policy that helps Malaysians should be based on needs and merit, not race. But changing a policy that's become so entrenched will not be easy. Florence Louis, Al Jazeera, Kuala Lumpur, for Counting the Cost.
No, it won't be easy, nor will be winning this election. And we're going to talk more about that and the Indigenous economic policy with Roman Bose. He's a Southeast Asia specialist at IHS. Roman, let's start with the election itself and all this billing that we're looking at, the toughest election in 50 years for the ruling party. What is it, economically speaking, that's making it so tight?
I think it's many factors that are actually challenging the ruling party at the moment. One of it is clearly the economy that needs to be tackled. Prime Minister Najib Razak obviously has a whole slew of plans that he intends to implement after the elections. He's already pushed in a whole bunch of plans ahead of time: the economic transformation plan, the government transformation plan, the the new economic model that they are trying to introduce within the country itself. All these various plans obviously are aimed at boosting the economy. However, the critical issues for the Malaysian economy at the moment are actually getting more revenue within the country itself. We've seen GDP at 5.6% last year. That's expected to drop this year to 5.2%. So it's basically reviving the Malaysian economy that's at stake at this election.
And the way that the politicians are going about this, I'm going to be careful with my wording here, but the idea that both sides are actually being a bit creative, yes, exactly, creative with their money, and essentially offering it to voters for their support. What do you make of that?
I think, the whole issue of money in elections is very interesting. And this phenomenon is not just restricted to Malaysia. We see this throughout the whole of Southeast Asia. You see this happening in countries like Singapore, in Thailand, even in Indonesia. At election time, very often, you have goodies introduced. And policies introduced. If you vote for the ruling party, you will get development, you will get aid, you will get assistance. But what's interesting to note is that the aid is not specifically targeted at one privileged group. It's targeted specifically at the poor, it's targeted at the economically disadvantaged, and the majority of them actually affect the bulk of Malaysians. So, we can't really look at this as a sense of corruption. But what it is obviously incentivizing voters to vote for either the ruling party or for the opposition, given their manifesto and the promises that they have made in terms of helping the poor, in terms of reducing cost of living for the average Malaysian.
Okay, so if not direct corruption or bribery, then what about the idea of cronyism, something which sort of seems to, lurk around Malaysian politics and seems to have done so for many years?
I think the issue of cronyism is something that really needs to be tackled in Malaysia. It's something that's almost systemic. That's something that the ruling party has tried to tackle. The MACC, the Malaysian Anti-Corruption Commission, has tried to tackle some of the smaller fish and big fish in this issue. But this is something that's not going to go away. Even if the opposition does win at this election, it's unclear whether they'll be able to tackle it because it's so endemic and systemic. The individuals that are involved in this. We have individuals on both sides of the ruling party and in the opposition coalition who have connections, who have vested interests. However, you need more than just political will in terms of doing that. You need to convince the civil service to get on board. You need to convince the public to understand that you no longer need to bribe officials. In fact, that is a no-no. That's something that's unacceptable.
Right, Roman, let's go back to the economic policy. Bumiputra, as it's called, this policy, which favoured indigenous Malays. You look back at when it was created, and it was designed to create some economic equality, to bring the indigenous Malays up to the level of everyone else. It looks like now it's ended up sort of over-favouring them, and other skilled people from other races have left. Did it just go wrong, or was it poorly executed?
I think the Bumiputra policy is one that's really, really controversial, even among those who have benefited from the policy itself. When it was set up, the aims were very noble. The way of implementing it as well at the beginning were very novel to a country that had just come out through through racial riots, as it were. However, along the way, a lot of the policies had been misused. There had been abuses, and this is not a policy that can continue in its present form. I think that's something that the current government realizes. It's true the policy doesn't work. It needs major reform, but the kind of reform that needs to take place is also something that has to be done with sensitivity. After all, you're affecting the majority Malays within the country itself, and this is something that has benefited them for several decades. But having said that, the Chinese and the Indians in Malaysia have also benefited to a certain extent. They have had successes within the country itself. So I think it's unfair to say that the policy has only benefited Malay Malaysians. Chinese and Indian Malaysians have also benefited to some extent. Of course, given that they haven't benefited as much as Malays have under this policy. It'll be interesting to see what happens at this election and depending on who wins, how they will take this policy forward or dismantle it altogether.
Roman Bose from IHS talking Malaysia with us. Thank you, Roman. And that is our show for this week, but there's more for you online and in fact on your iPad if you have one. This is the redesigned Al Jazeera English for iPad app. You can hit the programs button at the bottom, look for Counting the Cost, and there's our back catalogue of episodes for you to watch whenever you want. You can download that from the App Store. You can also get in touch with us by tweeting either me at Kamal AJE, our business editor at Abid Oliver Ali, or by dropping us an email, countingthecost@aljazeera.net. But that is it for this edition of Counting the Cost. I'm Kamal Santamaria from the whole team. Thanks for joining us. The news on Al Jazeera is next.